and thank all the people who are here, and maybe a few more will show up. I see some blank spaces over here. Michael mentioned that I am in my darkroom, and you could see that I am. Directly behind me, you see the enlarger that I use. I'm going to swivel my desktop computer around. You could see the other side of the room. There's another enlarger back there. And what I cannot show you is the side of the room that I'm on, which has 5 more enlargers, all exactly the same. They're the Saunders LPL enlargers, come from Japan. They're really fine enlargers. I work in this darkroom myself, and when I teach workshops that involve darkroom work, we have a whole group of people working in here. So this is where I work. And I am sitting at my computer, and when I do my digital work, I'm right here also. And I'm kind of in a corner of the door to the darkroom is at the far end. So the benefit for me when I'm working digitally is I always have exactly the same background lighting. I'm not dealing with computers sitting at a window that varies day, night, and different times of the year. And that allows me to see the work that I'm doing in color, in particular, without distracting and changing background ambient light. So that's what I do. That's very, very important. I mentioned that I do darkroom work and I do digital work. All of my black and white work is traditional darkroom, film, printing on traditional papers. All of my color work is now digital. I had scanned all of my former transparencies that I had done on film, and that's all converted to digital. And the reason that I did that was that the products that I was using for color had basically disappeared, and I had no choice. But with black and white, all the products that I've used have remained. And today, the printing papers that are available are absolutely the best I have ever used. So I have actually no desire to switch to digital with my black and white work. I think that the work that I could get out of the darkroom is not only richer, but it's also more subtle. So what I'm going to do today is go through some of my work. In talking with Michael, he said that most of the people who I'm looking at over here who are on this Zoom discussion may know me, but I'm going to assume that there are at least a few people who don't know me. So I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to me through my photographs. So what I've done on my computer screen, and hopefully you'll be able to see it, is go to this and then open up an image. Hopefully you could all see that. This is one of my early images made on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains. I call it Basin Mountain Approaching Storm. And a lot of people who know me are familiar with this photograph. Perhaps some people who don't know me are familiar with this photograph. It's kind of, you might say, my version of Moonrise over Hernandez, shall we say. It's probably my most known image. Early on in my career, after graduating from college, I had gotten a couple of degrees in mathematics from UCLA back in 1965 and 1967, and went to work for a few years at a place called Aerospace Corporation, because I never really got to what I really wanted to do, which was to be a groundbreaking researcher in subnuclear physics or cosmological physics. And I realized along the way I was over my head. And along the way, I had picked up a hobby of photography. And at some point I said, I cannot deal with working in the aerospace industry any longer. I'm going to take a chance and go into photography. That was in late 1970, and I've been in photography ever since. I basically consider myself an amateur. I consider myself an amateur because an amateur does something for the love of doing it. And I truly love doing it, even though I'm doing it professionally. So I think I'm in kind of the best of all possible worlds there. I started out with working on a landscape like the image that you're seeing here, and working also on parts of the landscape. This is another image that I'm quite well known for, fallen sequoias in Sequoia National Park. Both of those photographs were made back in the 1970s. And what I'm going to do from here on out is talk about photographs based on, shall I call them, projects. Projects that basically came to me. A lot of people who are in photography try to think of what their next project would be. I've never done that. What has happened is along the way, I have gotten involved in something just by chance coming upon it. And then it became a project. And one of those projects was also in the 1970s. I was living in Southern California at the time, and I watched the start of a fire that became known as the Agura Malibu fire that burned 25,000 acres of chaparral and stream-side woodland over the next 24 hours. And I started photographing that area because I was living right adjacent to it. And fortunately, the winds carried the fire the other way. And it led to a series of photographs made during the fire, but photographed after the fire. So this is one of those. I made over 100 images because the area was just right across the freeway from where I lived. And I would go there every morning with my dog, take him for a walk, and make a photograph or two in the burned area. And eventually it ended up being a 10-image portfolio that I called Aftermath, which had nothing to do with my math background, but it was the aftermath of the fire. And effectively, it was a story of, you might call it a reversal. It was from death to rebirth. It was what looked like the death of the land in the fire, and then how everything came back. In fact, actually, the trees that you see in this photograph look like they're burnt to a crisp. It turns out that the bark was singed, the trees all leafed out next year, and they came back. I never found the tree that was killed in that fire, which was quite amazing. In 1980, I walked into a place called Antelope Canyon, and it was the most astonishing experience of my life. Michael mentioned the slit canyons. Here's an example, not of Antelope Canyon, but Lower Antelope Canyon that I made a few years later. But the slit canyons, as I call them, I used to call them slot canyons, by the way, because that reminds me too much of Las Vegas. And the farther away I could get from Las Vegas, the better it is. But the slit canyons just entranced me. I do not know if anybody had ever photographed these places before I did, but up until today, I've seen a body of work by anybody that preceded my own. So while some people may have been there before I was, I think that I may have been the one that actually opened up what became a tsunami of photography eventually into the slit canyons. But these are places I could never have imagined until walking into them. So that became in essence, a lifetime project. I no longer go into these canyons because they have become commercial extravaganzas. And they are actually literally too sacred to me to deal with the crowds and the commercialism of the canyons anymore. Now, when I do go into slip canyons further north in Utah, they are different from these, but they are really quite amazing. It was in 1980, January 1st, 1980, that I first walked into Antelope Canyon. And 6 months later, I walked into the Cathedrals of England, and never would have guessed that I would have had any interest in photographing. Whoops, I don't know what's happened there. Is everybody still with me? I now have to get back to where I was.
We can hear you.
Here I am. Okay, that's good. I suddenly had weird things going on my screen. I assume that you did. This was part of a project on the Cathedrals of England that started after I started seeing these places. They were so architecturally overwhelming to me that I felt I had to photograph these structures. They were amazing. This actually is not part of a cathedral, but an abbey ruin. This is Fountains Abbey in England. And this is a room called the Lay Brothers Refectory. The Lay Brothers were the lay people who worked there. They were not part of the clergy. And this is where they had dinner. A refectory is a dining hall. So this room is 100 yards long. And the one thing that you may want to know when you look at this structure is that when you look at that stonework, there is not a drop of mortar that was used in constructing this room. So it's all just carefully meshed together piece of stone. I'll jump to another project that started also by chance in the early 1990s. If you put your hand across cover up the bottom of this photograph, the sand dunes, and just look at the top, that was a photograph that I made in 1990 in Utah. It was in a place called the Lockhart Basin Road, and there were these buttes that were above the road. And together with my wife and good friend and workshop co-instructor Don Kirby, we decided to camp right here while we were scouting for a workshop. And I noticed that the sun was lowering in the sky, and the near butte, the one right in the middle, was going into shade where the far cliffs were still in sunlight. And I thought it could really be interesting to photograph that thing if that near butte goes totally into shade while the cliffs are still in sunlight. And while I was watching it, the moon popped up. And I thought, boy, if the moon can get high enough and not too high before the lighting works the way I want, it would really be great. And it did. And I made the photograph. But the bottom half of that photograph was just sagebrush. It was very uninteresting. And while I made the photograph, I was thinking, what do I do with the bottom half of that photograph? It's not working. And I thought, well, maybe I could just make a panoramic photograph, just the upper part of what you see. And it was on my mind, it was bugging me. The next day we continued on the road on our scouting trip, and suddenly the dune image that you see at the bottom came into view. It's a photograph I had made 15 years earlier in Death Valley, California. And out of nowhere, it came to mind that maybe I could put that in the bottom of the image, just combine two negatives. And several months later, I went into the darkroom with the hope of being able to get close enough in a days-long session to continue working on it and see if I could put these two negatives together. And I did it on my third attempt. I was in the darkroom no longer than 1 hour when I made the photograph. And At that point, it suddenly occurred to me, how many photographs do I have that are half good? And maybe I could put together with something else that's half good. And a project started that I called Ideal Landscapes. In other words, if this landscape that you're looking at actually existed, I would photograph it. So I started putting things together. And the first time I showed the set of photographs that I had made by 1994, I did it at a workshop, and it almost caused a riot. There were a couple people at the workshop who thought this was really interesting and wonderful. There were a whole bunch of people that were anywhere from offended to furious. They just thought this is horrendous to do something like that. I remember one person who had taken several workshops with me, literally pounding his fist on the table, saying a photograph should be evidentiary. You should place your tripod down and show what's in front of you, period. Well, I continued showing these things, and I found that all the people who were opposed to this had ultimately changed their mind. A most recent one that I did is this. These are two photographs. The upper part, which are the mountains, are the Lofoten Islands in Norway. The lower part is a cove in the Malibu coast in California. In order to get the lighting to be the same, I did a reversal on the lower part of the image and meshed it together with the upper part and created this receding wave and mountains. What's my thinking behind doing something like this? Well, think about another art form, and that is literature. People like Dickens and Dostoevsky and Mark Twain have created characters, fictional characters. I see nothing wrong in creating a fictional landscape from two landscapes. Those people have been praised for their literature. I hope that some people could say this is valid for photography, and I've been doing it. Okay, let me go to another project. This is radically different. This is something that a lot of people have likened to looking like the painting by Edvard Munch, The Scream. And I see that too in this one. This, together with a number of other images I photographed, were made because of a lost environmental battle that I had been fighting for nearly 10 years against a gravel pit and quarry not very far down the road from my own home. And we won every legal case, and the county council actually then stepped in, changed the laws, and ignored several laws and gave the company the permit. And this was a series that I did on one log that was on my own property that I found after we had had a huge windstorm that blew down a lot of trees. I live on 20 acres and it's a forested land. And after the clearing of the downed trees from a huge windstorm called a microburst, it's kind of like a tornado in one direction rather than swirling around. It knocked down so many trees that we had 17 truckloads of trees taken out of my property. And I found a small log, no more than 6 feet long and maybe 6 inches in diameter, that had these incredibly weird burls and swirls in the wood. And one day it just occurred to me, I could photograph those things and it's going to convey the feelings that I had of darkness and despair and being screwed by the county, and get my thoughts down. So this is very different from all the other images that I've ever made, but I had to do it. In the late 1990s, I was invited to do some workshops down in Peru, where, among other things, we would go to Machu Picchu. I don't know how many of you out there have ever been to Machu Picchu, but I'm sure that every one of you have seen photographs of it, as I had. So I knew what the place looked like before I got there. That was until I walked through the gate. It was completely different from anything that I had ever seen in a photograph. And I just couldn't even explain how or why. But I was not only taken by the structures at Machu Picchu, but even more so by the setting. Machu Picchu is located on the edge of a ridge. It's kind of a knife edge ridge. And there are mountains around it that go up to over 20,000 feet in altitude. And Machu Picchu itself is at 8,400 feet. So you have mountains that are 2.5 miles higher than you, surrounding you. And what I really was taken by was the setting of Machu Picchu within this mountain environment. And over a period of 3 years, I continued photographing Machu Picchu primarily because of how it sat in the landscape. So that became another project that never would have occurred to me except for being there. I've shown you only black and white. I do color. I'm going to show you a couple of color images. This is a wood detail on a limber pine. And this is just to show you that I do color. This was actually made initially on film. It has been scanned. It's now digital. Here's a photograph I made just about 2 years ago in Iceland. And this is digital right from the beginning. I'm at the foot of a glacier in Iceland. You have an iceberg in the foreground that's right in front of me. Fortunately, I was standing on solid ground. And what you're seeing in the upper left corner is actually the reflection of the foot of the glacier in the water. It's kind of an abstract thing that throws you off a little bit. And it's the direction that I've gone in my own photography over the years, more toward abstraction than I ever would have done at the start. Let me go to this next one. Here is a photograph of a place that I saw on the way to Antelope Canyon that first day that I discovered it. This is a little side canyon, but I didn't photograph it that day because I didn't have a wide enough lens at that point. This was photographed about 13 years later. And this is a little side canyon, just showing you some of the remarkable sculpture that you see within those canyons. And this is a photograph that after I first printed it, and I didn't print it very well, and part of the reason was the papers that existed at that time, they were all graded papers. This is a photograph that I made just 1.5 years ago after rediscovering this image. And it is in my latest book, and let me just show you this. Here's a book called The Essence of Photography that just came out. And I was able to put that in the book because there was a delay in publication because of the pandemic and some other delays. And I was able to get into the book a photograph that I had first rediscovered from years ago. And at the moment, I almost wish I didn't do that, and I'll explain that momentarily. But anyway, this is a photograph from long ago that's in this book. I'll go back to the photograph itself. And this was rediscovered at the end of 2019 and printed in 2020. I'll just show you the cover of my other book that's fairly well known these days, by the publisher Rocky Nook. This is The Art of Photography, now in its second edition and several printings. First edition had multiple printings. But I am going to go from this to what I'm working on right now. And I'm working on it with the hope that it will be a new book. So let me go off of the screen share for a moment and put myself back on the screen over here to let you know what's going on. I do workshops. I've done workshops for many, many years. And at the end of 2019, after I came back home from my very last workshop, which was in Utah, ending in early November, I went into the hospital for the first of 2 hip replacement surgeries. So early November of 2019, I had the hip joint on my right side replaced. And 5 weeks later, I had the hip joint on my left side replaced. And I was laid up for a while because of those hip operations. Just prior to that, I had actually started a review of old negatives, really starting right from the beginning, or you might say just after the beginning, starting immediately after I took an Ansel Adams workshop in 1970 in Yosemite Valley. And it was only a few months after that that I quit my job that I mentioned earlier and decided to go into photography. So at the end of 2019, I started reviewing my negatives in a very systematic, chronological way. And it was with the hope that along the way, I may find a hidden gem that I had overlooked in the past, maybe even a couple of things through all the years. What shocked me was the number of things that I kept finding that I had never printed. And a few that I remembered wrestling with in the darkroom, but I never printed it successfully. And then there were some that when I found, actually I was looking at contact proofs, not negatives. When I found them, it looked like it was something I never remembered, like somebody else had photographed it. So it was completely out of my memory. And I started printing these things once I was able to get back on my feet and stand at the enlarger for any length of time, which was painful at first. So I was very limited, but it took on a life of its own. And of course, then the pandemic hit, just about the time that I was really able to get into the darkroom and start my printing, which was by about late February of 2020. And shortly after that, boom, the COVID pandemic hit. Within weeks, I had to cancel all of my workshops for the first half of 2020, and then all the rest for the year. And eventually, I've canceled all the workshops for the first half of this year, 2021. So with all of my workshops canceled, I suddenly had nothing to do but get into the darkroom after checking out what I was finding. And what I'm going to be showing you now is the project that I am tentatively hoping to get a book printed on. And I'm sort of calling it 2020 and vicinity, because a few of these negatives were found before 2020. Most of them were found during 2020 and subsequently this year. And most have been printed in just the past year and a half. So let me start with this one. This is in Ansel's country, Yosemite. Most of you may recognize this, but probably not this viewpoint. That's Bridal Veil Falls, way in the background. The viewpoint that I found over here way back a number of years ago
Excuse me, Bruce, we don't see anything.
was before, for those of you.
We're not
What is
seeing
that?
your screen.
Are you not
We're not-
seeing it?
No.
Okay,
There
let
we
me
go.
go back. Let me go back over here. Do you see it now? Oh, thank you, Michael.
It's
Can
coming.
you see it,
Yep. Yes.
everybody? Okay. Now you see it? Okay. Yeah. Again, this is Yosemite. Way in the background in the upper left, you see the Cathedral Rocks and Bridal Veil Falls. The viewpoint is what's unusual about this. And in addition to the images, one of the things that I bring out in the writing in this proposed book is the idea that even in a place that has Ansel Adams' stamp on it, you can find new things. You don't have to be intimidated. You could go ahead and do your shooting. And I found this viewpoint. For those of you who have been to Yosemite, probably familiar with the tunnel viewpoint, where Ansel has made some key photographs himself. This is before you get to the tunnel, and I had pulled off to the side of the road, climbed over a wall that's adjacent to the turnout area, and was able to work my way down some sloping granite until I came to this viewpoint, which was really quite remarkable, and managed to photograph Bridal Veil Falls and the Cathedral Rocks from there. All of the photographs that I will now be showing, can you see that? Michael, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, good. Then I assume everybody can. This is on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains. A lot of things going on over here. You could see a mountaintop, Mount Humphreys, just sticking above the clouds. And with the wild structures down below leading up to the mountains, that's an area known as the buttermilk country, and the sun and shadow. It's a very complex image that I had completely forgotten about and rediscovered it. Here's something from Utah. There is no country, no landscape that I've ever seen that compares with that of Utah. It has a uniqueness that is all its own. And I don't think that there's any place else in the world that has this type of a landscape. It is just really quite remarkable. So when you're in a place like this, it's almost hard to stand up straight because the landscape kind of swirls you around. It almost makes you dizzy. Utah is very special. Let me jump from this to a different aspect of Utah. And again, the photographs I'm showing you now are old photographs that I discovered in this review of negatives and contact proofs just in the past year and a half. So this is something I'd never printed before. This is something called the chocolate drops, and way back in the distance, you see a spire. What other landscape on Earth looks anything like this? It's just remarkable. In addition to finding landscapes in areas that effectively become a retrospective of my life, I've also found things like this. This is back in the Cathedrals of England. This is the crypt at Winchester Cathedral. Winchester Cathedral was built in the wrong place. It was built on a swamp, and it floods every year. Winchester Cathedral is basically a tri-level cathedral. There's the nave at one level, and then you go down about a half a level and there's the crypt, and you go up above the crypt and there's the choir. So it is the crypt that has flooded every year since the cathedral was built. And when I was there, it was during the period of flood. It was closed off to the public, but I had gotten special permission to go down there and photograph. I'll tell you folks, it was creepy. I was there all by myself, walking around almost knee deep in the water, which was cold as hell, but it was worth it to be able to make a photograph like this. This was a 20-minute exposure under the lighting that was there. Here's something along the Washington coast. It is the state of Washington that I live in now. This is a place called Ruby Beach. And this is an enormous piece of driftwood. And then the sea stacks out there in the ocean in the Pacific on a pretty stormy day. I'll tell you, it was quite difficult to set up my tripod and camera and dark cloth wrapped around the camera in my head to focus on this. But there was just something wonderful about both the driftwood, the forms in the driftwood itself, and how it also serves as simply a frame for what's off in the distance, which was really quite exciting to me. Let me jump back to Utah. This is just a sand mud pattern below a little kind of a sloping chute, kind of a waterfall, but on a slope. And I found this magnificent shape just in the sand. This was shortly after a couple of days of pretty heavy rain. And it's really interesting what you can find in nature. Really quite remarkable. Now you may wonder, what is this? I believe it's a seed pod. When I was living in Southern California, I found a whole bunch of these things, about 4 inches or so across, with these pointy spikes that kind of look like the tusks of a mastodon or mammoth or something like that. And I gathered them up. I never was able to identify what plant they came from, but I brought this home, put it just on a sheet of glass, and photographed this against a black background. I just thought it created a remarkable design. So kind of keeping my eyes open for anything that is visually interesting, and this struck me as extremely interesting in a visual manner. Here's another one I rediscovered. I'll just call it Reflections, and that's what you're looking at. And because I've rediscovered this in the past year, I've obviously had very few people to show it to because we're all under lockdowns. So the few people that I have shown it to, and starting to become more as we're getting vaccinated, and hopefully everybody out there is or will be soon vaccinated. The people who have seen this ask me, am I looking at reflections in water? And my answer is, well, I like to be honest, but that doesn't necessarily mean I have to blurt out the truth. So I'll just continue to call it Reflections. Now, the biggest surprise of all is what I'm going to show you next. I'm going to show you just 3 examples of this, but let me talk about this first. So let me stop the screen share while I talk about something other than an image. My first book was titled Visual Symphony. And it is comprised of 4 parts. The first part is landscapes. The second part was actually not completed when the publisher agreed to do the book. It was called Urban Geometrics. The third, that was actually the third part. The second part was Cathedrals of England, then the Urban Geometrics, and then the last part was the Slip Canyons. So 4 sections to the book, like 4 movements in a classical music symphony, and that's why it's titled Visual Symphony. In working with the publisher for the book, they wanted something more than the Slip Canyons that I originally proposed to them. So I already had loads of photographs of landscape, and I had already done my studies of the Cathedrals of England. And I was working on something new at the time, which was photographs of urban areas, large skyscrapers in urban areas in large cities, which started in, of all places, Calgary, Canada. And then I started photographing at other places and put those images together in Visual Symphony under the title Urban Geometrics. When I started doing my review and got into the early 80s, I started finding some images that I had made at the same time and in the same places, but had never made it into the book. And they were completely different. They were largely based on reflections in the windows on these buildings. So let me go back here. And this time I'll click on this. That's where we were before. Could everybody see that? Michael, you'll have to tell me, can you see that?
Yep.
You can?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. Okay, now let's go to this. This is an example of what I'm doing now, what I'm finding from mostly the mid 80s, and then they continued into the late 80s, that I'm calling urban enigmas. This is in Calgary, and what you're seeing is all in reflections of window. And if you notice toward the lower left, with all those horizontal lines down there, it's actually a selfie. I'm in there. You could see me, and you may be able to see a little bit of the leg of my tripod that was being set up to make this photograph, okay? Here's another one from Chicago. Wild stuff. I mean, these are places that, since most of us live in cities, and most of us who don't live in cities visit cities periodically, these are scenes that you can find in most cities if you really look at what's around you, and they could be fascinating. Here's another one. This is from inside a lobby in Minneapolis. So these are things that I have been putting together, and especially things like these last 3 have come at a complete surprise to me. When I started finding these, I was just shocked. I remember doing them, but they had completely gone out of my memory. So what I'm working on right now is a new book, and hopefully the publisher that has published my recent books may be interested in doing it, but I'm not sure. I have no guarantee, and hopefully there will be a publisher who will do this, and I'm really quite excited about it. So that's all I have to say right now. Hopefully that was of some interest or some value to you. And could I open this up to any kind of questions that any of you have? I'll try to answer them.
Anybody?
Remember
Hey,
to
hey, I have
yeah,
a
remember,
question.
yeah.
Hey,
Oh,
Bruce,
Rita.
it's Rita.
Who is it?
How are you? Really good
Oh,
to hear from you.
I don't see you. but
Yeah,
I,
that's okay. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm on it in my car driving. So
oh, that's why I
I've been,
can't see you. Okay.
yeah. So I've been listening to Bruce Jenkins, and you and he are both have been reviewing and finding, as you say, darlings within your collection. And do you think if you had seen these before, you would have recognized it? You advise us to go through our collections more, I guess, more frequently, or is it just the length of time that you haven't seen these that it's made these impressions?
I think it's both. In the writing that I put together with the imagery for this proposed book, I absolutely suggest that people, especially people who have been photographing for a long time, go all the way back. See what you've done in the past that for one reason or another, you either passed up or you could not print successfully long ago, and you may be able to now. And that's true whether you're working traditionally or digitally. For those people, and I suspect a lot of people have switched to digital, you could go back and scan old negatives if you could find that they're worthy of experimenting with, just seeing if you could get something more out of them today than you ever were able to long ago. And I will bet that you're going to find some remarkable things. If you're new to the game, you still may find some remarkable things that you did just a year ago or 2 years ago or whatever. But I actually think that you'll find more, obviously, if you've been in the game for a long time and you have a long set of archives. One of the things that could be a problem, by the way, for people who have been doing digital for a long time, there is such a backlog that you may not even be able to easily go through what you have. And what I mean by that is this. About a year and a half ago, I personally passed kind of a milestone in my own shooting, which is almost exclusively with 4x5 over the years. I exposed my 15,000th negative. And that was a big deal, okay? I know of people today who have digital cameras and they go on a month-long trip and they will expose 20 or 30,000 images on that trip. So if you have been doing digital, you may have such an enormous backlog of things, it would almost be impossible to deal with that immense backlog. I mean, it would take you 4 lifetimes to go through what you have. I'm lucky. I very carefully work on each image. And it's interesting to have found so many good things along the way. It's really been an eye-opener to me. I never would have guessed that I could find so many. So Rita, yeah, I would absolutely say, go back over what you've done, however far back that is, because I'll bet there's a lot of good stuff that's hidden in those old images.
I stopped.
Anybody else have a question?
Yeah, I also I stopped counting the number of images and just measure them in terabytes now. it's the easiest way. I was going to make a comment. You and I have a commonality in that I also left mathematics to do a couple things, and one of them is photography. But I was going to comment on what you said earlier about doing your composited landscapes and how outraged people were. This was in, I think you said 1994. That was a good 10, 12 years after Ulsman started doing his composited image. So I find it curious that the people taking your workshops were not informed enough to know something about the history of photography.
Let me comment on that. You're right. And at the same time, you're wrong. And I'll tell you why. First of all, I really enjoy Jerry Ullsman's work. I did a workshop with him right here at my home years ago. And he's an absolutely wonderful fellow. But there's a real difference between what Jerry did and does still, and what I did. Jerry's work is made up of very often multiple negatives, sometimes 5, 6, 7 negatives for one image. And they are meant to be surreal, okay? So you look at them as kind of a dreamlike thing, and they're pretty well understood that way. Mine are not. I'm pulling off a subterfuge. Let me go back to the screen share for a moment while I'm talking and go back to, let's say, this one. Can you all see that?
Yes.
This is meant almost to fool you. It is meant almost to have people say, wow, where was that? And, you know, if I answer by saying, which part of the image are you looking at? A lot of people don't like it. So it's meant to look like a real landscape, but it isn't. So in a sense, I'm being dishonest. And there's the difference, Jim. I think you're right. And people should know what Ullsman did, but at the same time, I'm doing something different. And I wasn't influenced by Ullsman, even though I was very much aware of his work, until after I actually put several of these, as I call them, ideal landscapes together, and then realized, my God, you know, in a way, I'm doing sort of what Jerry Ullsman does by creating something, but yet I'm creating something that is supposed to look like it exists. So I could see why some people were really upset about that.
Well, let me add to what I said. Yeah, I'm very familiar with Ullsman's work. However, I have a photograph made in 1902 of the Campanile in Venice, which had stood for 1,000 years at the time, and it collapsed. And photographers knew it was going to collapse because people started seeing cracks in it. So they set up their cameras and waited for it to collapse and then made a photograph of it. And the particular photograph I'm thinking of shows the rubble of the Campanile, and with all the dust shooting up out of the rubble. And all of that dust was added in the darkroom. So, you know, this has been around for a long time. That was my comment on people's ignorance of history of photography.
Bruce, do you find
you know, and several people were entranced by it, but a number of people were not. And it led to a great discussion about photographic fiction. I continued showing the work. I was very happy about it. But then again, some people will say, well, every photograph is fictitious. So then you could really start defining what is fiction and what isn't fiction, you know, so it's up to you.
That was going to be my comment. So,
Bruce, do you, it almost sounds like you start a project when you're just inspired by the moment, like when you first walked into the cathedrals. Is that the case, or are there some projects where you, walk into a slick canyon and say, oh, this would make a great project, or are there others that you think about before you start them?
I have never started a project that I thought about in advance, never. It turns out that every project that I've done was one because I stumbled upon something and it became so interesting that it became a project. So I know of people who say that they are thinking of doing a project. I think that's wonderful. Nothing wrong with that. I've never done that. It has always started by coming to something that I realized along the way is actually different and is unique in its own right, and therefore became a project.
Okay.
I don't
Anyone?
know if you had a further question or a comment on. Yeah. Larry, did you have anything further you wanted to say about that?
Well, just the first project I ever did, I started thinking in one direction and ended up changing that direction about, it seems like about 40 times in the first 2 years before I finally found an approach that worked for me. And so my thought was, gee, I could have saved myself 2 years of banging my head against the wall if I had just thought this out a little bit more beforehand. So it's kind of nice to see that, inspiration can strike without, having to put in the 2 years of struggling with how it's going to work.
Well, that's how it's worked for me, without any question. The burnt landscape basically came about because I was working at home. My wife was working in downtown LA, so basically I was the house husband, and we had a dog, and I had to take the dog out for a walk. And since this huge area had burned that was just right across the freeway from where I lived, I simply decided, well, this is a different landscape. It was very bothersome, but it was okay. And what made it okay was several months before that fire, I had been in that area and I photographed a group of trees. And I went back there to see those dead trees. And they weren't dead. They were alive. And I saw that the fire had swept through so rapidly with the high winds that were pushing it that basically it singed the ankles on those trees, and the trees were fine. And if I had seen those trees completely gutted, I would have been too depressed to go in there. But I realized, my God, look, these trees are alive. And it gave me the optimism to go there and photograph. So really, I went there. It was a different landscape. It was a black and white landscape suddenly. And I basically went each day with only 1 or 2 negatives with me to expose. And that was it. If I didn't find anything, fine. The dog had a good walk. If I found something, I couldn't find more than 1 or 2, depending on how many sheets of film I had with me. And that was it. And at the time that I was at about 80 or 90 negatives, I suddenly said, I have something over here that's really different and unique. And the project became a reality at that point, not before that. It was realizing that I had something that was really quite different.
Well, I also have to thank you for your books. They're very easy to tell from my other ones. I've got about a marker in about every page. I find them very insightful and useful. So thank you very much. I've learned a lot from them.
Can
Well,
I
Larry,
pose,
thank you for that. That's very nice.
if I can
Hey,
pose two,
Michael, you were going to say.
I'm sorry. May I cut in? Bruce, hi. I also want to echo what the last fellows just said about books. I also have your books with lots of Post-it notes in many places, and I think I've learned quite a bit from you. So I have two questions for you. You said you had postponed several workshops because of your hip replacements, I guess it was, and then also the COVID. Will you be resuming any of those in the coming year?
Okay, yes, absolutely. Anybody could go to my website.
Okay.
You could just Google Barnbaum, BARNBAUM, or www.barnbaum.com. You'll go to the workshop page. They are opening up again later this year. I did not cancel anything because of the hip operations, though. What happened was I did the hip operations as soon as I finished the last workshop in 2019 in order to be able to get back in shape for the next workshop, which was scheduled in April of 2020, which is actually a backpacking workshop that I do in some of those canyons in Utah. And I wanted to get myself back in shape by that time. And then the workshop was canceled. And that was because of the pandemic. So not because of the hips. By that time I was jogging again, and I'm still jogging, and everything is fine.
Good to hear. And I will check your website. And the second question I had, and I don't mean to dominate, I'm sure some of the folks who are watching have put together projects for the purpose of either a book or portfolio or presentation or exhibit or whatever. I find my biggest problem is trying to cull out the winners, or what I think are the best, let's say 10 or so out of maybe 20 or 30 pictures. Can you give me any insight? Because I just seem to struggle with which ones to pick. I don't know if it's my personality or I just have a bunch of mediocres and I can't decide. Can you give me any insight on that?
Well, I don't know your imagery, so I don't know if you have winners or losers or some in between. But let me just say one thing about picking out images for a group. It would seem, the logical thing would seem to be, well, it's simple. You pick out the 10 best. And that's not the case. Because once you have a group, you have to think of what makes the best group. And it may be that, let's say, your two best photographs are in one way or another somewhat similar. And you may have to pull out one of those two and put in the 11th one to make it more varied. And that makes a better group. You see what I mean?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so you have to think of the group as being the unit. And often that can be a very difficult thing, because now you have a unit and you have to figure out which are the best ones for variety and interest and flow from one to the next and so on and so forth. It's like putting together a book like I'm doing right now. I was putting aside all these images that I was printing. And at some point I said to myself, I can't just dump a bunch of images on a publisher and say, put something together. They're going to say, what the hell do we do with this? So I realized I had to create a sequence. And believe me, that was very difficult. Just putting together the sequence and trying to make some sense of it. So I've done that now to my satisfaction. But you know, I'll never be 100% satisfied for the simple reason that there are a lot more images that are good ones that I've eliminated because I figure you could only have so many in a book. You know, so it still becomes difficult. And who knows, maybe one or two that I have in there should not be in there. And one or two that I've eliminated should be in there. But I'm doing the best I can. So that's all you could do.